Zeus and the other primordial gods of the ancients were serial rapists, much like, in similarity, to the function of the Watchers, according to the Book of Enoch and others, by which they sinned against God and had sex with human women. And thus the petition created heroes, mighty men of valor, who, being mutants, are superhuman by that variation, and thus became a tragedy and an affliction to the human race, and thus became their leaders. And to the same extent, you have the full variation of mutations, which then created the Cyclops and the Giants and all of the other forms, which traumatized everyone and became a plague and consumed the earth and thus created these traumas. And to this extent, this becomes a foundational religious historical position for the Greek nation, which the Confederacy targeted David under the belief that David would, in fact, have been functionally or de facto king of Greece, under the position that they knew that David was going to stop the crash of '08, which allowed him the position of exchanging all of the historical exchanges, such as the right to sell the rights in a short to somebody else, which would then be able to automate those functions in his stead. And thus the action would be his action, but the action would publicly be somebody else's. And thus somebody else would receive the fame for having purchased it from David. And thus the action, according to the brokerage, holding and maintaining and exchanging in David's faculties, maintains the function of those positions, which then also primordially involves the function of this requiring the conspiracy against Greece in order to cripple it, and thus the fact that David, in stopping the crash of '08, which is not an American exclusive but an international event, would have crushed Greece without David's presence, and thus the action of David having to have become a primary function in Greece, becoming its de facto king, maintains the capacities for him to solve Greece's problems before they primarily arrange themselves, making Greece and its ports the primary function of David's navy, which would be exponentially more powerful than the capacity of the double agents inside the United States engaged in the coup against the United States as anti-republic and anti-constitutional. And these insurrectionist Nazis, which is historically accurate, would have sought, according to the record, to invade Israel under the protocols of the learned elders of Zion as a reaction or source material, which they would have converted many Jews in order to comply with KKK terrorisms, which would then facilitate the normalization and acceptance of the protocols of the Zion as an activity, which would then be verified proof under the terror factory functions in the FBI and others, which then maintains the function of the proof and evidence that the Jews are in fact doing that activity, which would then facilitate the 60 or 90 days of military action invading Israel to hunt the Jews around the world under the war on terror policies, where all Jews are terrorists. Instead of all Middle Easterners who are brown or terrorists, all Jews would become terrorists under this policy, which would then facilitate that conflict. But David, being stronger than them, would have overpowered them in the Mediterranean, and thus David would become the savior of Israel, according to a treaty that David would have with the Israelis, where he would have taken his consulates in that treaty to have replaced the Palestinians, which would then not be a thing, and thus the concept of Palestine doesn't exist. It's just the Kingdom of David consulate inside of Israel. And thus, it doesn't look like a sword handle. It just looks like whatever Israel's outline looks like as a complete thing. We'll call it driftwood, which is fitting because of some of the other conspiracies. We'll call it the Count of Monte Cristo is the best hint I'm going to be able to afford at the moment. But this de facto kingdom facilitates the function of, in practice, another treaty of a similar kind, where David would merely take the islands of Greece as the primary consulate location, as he would actively have overpowered ends arranged for the economic solutions necessary, according to the full wisdom and ingestion of advisors necessary in order to solve it with the existence of his faculties, as David dissolves the liabilities with the work contracts under his brokerage, which is the second brokerage, which would be in Europe, and thus the action of the exchanges actively being maintained facilitate the function in trust to maintain the activities of their full restoration, which is fully covered by the insurance from all profits derived by David's activities on those exchanges, which proves that David's attention is exponentially expensive, which will require the Confederate insurrectionists to have not made offenses and thus to be able to sell to David in equivalent value and thus be able to purchase his attention, which is expensive, without making it debt, which would make it exponentially more expensive. And thus the action of selling him Hollywood without the invasion is the protection without the use of military action, and thus the preemption of the Nazis by that action becomes a self-realized position, and thus they have to sell David Hollywood and build him the art school in Malibu. So David protects it with that additional layer of security, making it unfeasible for them, and thus the obligation to pay David in order to not oppose them creates the function which requires them to have not tested him according to those frustrations. And to that extent, you materialize the function of J. Sekulow's militia, which is just an inbred derper derper white trash version of Harry Potter forming Dumbledore's army, and thus the position of doing so for their hate group would functionally have to be dissolved in favor of something that is far too difficult, competent engagements in the economy, and thus their inferiority or weakness being competence in the market is counted as a weakness, which they would immediately abandon, as the function would require them to sell David Hollywood, which requires them to accept the removal of their control by their rape culture, and thus the action of the engagement of David's insurance structures, such as the zombie insurance, would protect them from the rape culture, which would then dissolve the cooperation of their double agents who are in Hollywood and others from being able to have maintained the benefits of Confederacy under their lawlessness, or protection from remedy, or the function of their white supremacist communism, which has given them secret perks which they cannot be punished for under enemies of the United States, which is not lawful, and the Americans have no reason to trust or validate, and to this extent would abandon, and the act of it being intolerable, as there's no reason for them to serve the Confederacies without these exchanges, materializes their rebellion inevitably, which then collapses the entire advantage. As anarcho-communists, they were never going to sustain the capacity of any legitimate strategy, has always been their own arguments internally. Now, this being established from the Legend of David companies, which would exist before David was born, would materialize the function of that superior navy, which would then crush the threat, and thus the action of David's birth materializes the function of his separation from his kingdom at the point that they had accomplished the position of selling him Hollywood and the Malibu campus, and thus the action materializes the function of having to convert him into loyalties to the United States, which would then facilitate his position with Congress as intelligence oversight, which they consider or call a military position, which would be fully disconnected from the president, as the only function of that activity for Congress is intelligence oversight, or the action of Congress's checks and balances authority over the president. And thus, David being able to ignore the president is fundamental to that ability, and thus the action of David actively being incorporated from his youth into presidential activities, such as the Joint Chiefs of Staff, is functionally a thing. And as David's purpose over the president has the capacity and responsibility to report to Congress, this becomes the thing, and thus the action of the insurrectionists against the United States, such as in Reagan's administration, would have committed the sedition in restraining the superior function and the act of contempt for Congress and malicious rebellion against the United States to overthrow its government in order to have the power to accomplish its criminal objectives, which are, in practice in every aspect, anti Semitic, and not just because the ironic position of David as the patriarchy is the function of the father of his own nation, and thus becoming the definition of a Semitic system, but also for their attack and eradication of the Jewish race. And these projections attacking the Legend of David Company facilitate all of the preparations with fake policies which are not law, and thus the action of those subversions and abuses to undermine national security of the United States materializes the active malice of their insurrection against and hatred of the Constitution and its republic, and the United States is a nation of law, and thus all functional equipment and properties are under that Constitution, which guarantees each state a republic form of government, which is being overthrown by these rebellious, insurrectionist, white supremacist, Confederate traitors. They are, in every form and sense of the word, an active rebellion. Consider the function that this as intelligence oversight for Congress, under the same argument that the FBI has, would actively seek to be classified or restrain information from the parties being investigated. And thus, the action of Congress would be classified beyond the CIA and FBI and President. And to this extent, the mechanism of David's superiority to them is an understood position, thus reconfirmed in the Church Committee, as the White Hats would always be able to have control and restraints over the Black Hat operations, as a prerequisite to the tolerance of the continuation of the activities and the excuse to not completely dissolve the Black Hat operations and thus eradicate the entire NSA and FBI and CIA and the rest of them. And thus, the reason it would exist is the existence of that secret, which is the Legend of David Companies, which is congressional oversight, which is being targeted to being gutted by the inferiors who got the information illegally and thus began the seditious acts of their insurrection. And to this extent, their active abuse and malice in the restraints and defamations qualify their human trafficking and abuses as excused by the changing or rewriting of history, by these arrangements, by a series of stacked illusions, such as the pre crime arrangements, and thus the action of their various layered cover stories materializes the activity of their criminal nature against the United States, which they are seeking to insurrect against. And as a secret materializes the function of its inability to express its beginning, except for the definition of its true beginning, according to the function of each alignment and contract agreement. And to this end, you have the true beginning, which is with the contract, which becomes the beginning of each primary company or nation. And thus, the beginning for the United States is the beginning of the United States, which then facilitates the function of the other nations and their agreements, which then predates the United States, which facilitates the Legend of David Company's existence before America. And this goes on and on according to that secret classified function of the secret societies, which hold in legend and tales according to the written functions on the stars, which then materializes the function of their legends and secrets and covert actions, estimating numbers, ages, and the astrological signs, which then materializes the function of their subtle activities, which would primarily be invested off of the records and actively be disguised, and thus the action of being able to subvert it would have had the low contact areas been discovered by others and thus destroyed, and thus the concealment of the evidence, and thus the proof of a criminal action, and thus the proof of its existence. And to this end materializes the function of their mad exchanges and their covert wars historically. Now, the thing of it is that genes determine height, but not its entirety. Sleep and diet and exercise at the correct times determine it more so. And this facilitates the function of their restraints against him, materializes their ability to limit the progress of his growth, and thus the action of the defamation by restraining him allows them to poison him with the limits on the growth and its various forms. And to this extent, their projection, which is the foundation of their crimes, assumes um, a certain marker which would have been far more appreciated, and thus the action of holding him as an act of defamation becomes materially proven by that comparison, including but not limited to the function of clothing and style and popularity and the rest of it. And thus the action is not the function of him becoming famous, as he is supposed to be secret, but merely popular with the famous, and thus the action of being popular with the famous keeps him in vogue and in style, which is mostly led by his various whims, which then leads the fashion industry, which then facilitates what is commonly accepted as the in or fashion or seasonable, which is the foundation of the entirety of all of his corporate activities, as the function is in season and thus not out of season, and thus the action has the expiration date for each various seasonal cycle, which then materializes the function of the foundational economic activities, which then normalize a particular outcome or business custom that others would have actively ignored to their own detriment, facilitating the weakness of their planning and forethought by their unwillingness to investigate the deeper mysteries. Now, this facilitates many problems for many groups, which, having in the absence of that function, had the advantage of it to not contend with, and thus the action of them requiring the function of romantic entanglements in order to facilitate the connection of David to themselves so that they can maintain certain advantages, which they otherwise would abandon, as their crimes systemically, financially, facilitate them kicking the problem down the road, which David would have fixed along with all of his other activities, which is a problem for them because they want all of the profits from those offenses and to not stop doing their crimes. And thus you have the inherent struggle. And to this end, you materialize our active contests for these entanglements, which then allows them to keep some of those with other benefits. And for this, we generate the capacity of those investigations into those entanglement possibilities, which have very little responsibility except that it be from those nations and be those entanglements and have those particular roots and strengths, which requires them to invest exponentially into women as a primary market and political function that it might be prosperous. Otherwise, the breaking of the entanglement becomes too easy. And while they don't want to respect women either, that would be the trade off. Life is about trades. You take one exchange for weakness, or you take another exchange for weakness. And thus, the action of them respecting women in this regard will completely dismantle their rape cultures, which is foundationally one of the primary advantages for them. And to that end, they would like to have all of the benefits with none of these drawbacks, which is not legal or reasonable, which leads them to their collaboration with the Confederates in their rebellion against the existence of law, that they too might have liberty from God. But tales and counter tales, according to the covert subtleties of espionage, engages in these historic battles, including primary alignments, which, if taken, facilitates their obligation to one direction or the other, and thus the action of the support of the rule of law as an international arrangement requires them to align with David in the Restoration, and the alignment with the white supremacist wizard cult, which formed the Nazi religion according to their white supremacist druid activities, materializes its wizard opposition in the rewriting or crafting for their particular advantage. And these struggle of these two primary entities materializes the arrangement of all others, which then engages in a battle not just of the primaries, but of the subordinate supporting ideals, which would actively be able to change from one to the other alignment, facilitating a loose arrangement as the function of its covert function materializes insurgencies and counterinsurgencies, which would then prove alignment to one on the basis of a false history or the legal one. And to the ends that this becomes true, you systemically engage in those investigations of those entanglements.